In the tumultuous aftermath of World War II, the world found itself divided into two distinct factions, each armed with its own arsenal of weapons. On one side stood the countries that embraced the might of American firepower, while on the other side stood those who favored the formidable might of the Russian or Soviet weaponry. For decades now, these two giants have dominated the global arms trade, commanding an overwhelming share of exports and shaping the course of history. However, in recent years, a seismic shift has occurred. While the United States continues to thrive in the arms market, selling weapons unabated, its Russian counterpart has witnessed a steep decline in arms exports, raising concerns and leaving us to ponder the reasons behind this dramatic turn of events. In this intriguing video, we will embark on a journey to unravel the mysteries surrounding the dwindling demand for Russian arms, examining the consequences of the Russian army's lackluster performance in Ukraine, and the implications this holds for none other than President Putin himself. But before that, we would love if you subscribe to the channel for more updates. See, Russia used to be a major player in the business of selling weapons around the world. It was basically the dynamic duo of arms exports with the United States, or back in the day, the Soviet Union. Here's the deal. Since around 1960, these two countries have consequently accounted for at least half, and usually more than 3/4 of all the weapons being sold globally. The rest of the sales were split between countries like France and the UK, and more recently also China. Russia used to have a bunch of customers like former Soviet countries, India and China both, while the US sold to other NATO members, Saudi Arabia and Japan. Lately, the US has been making more sales to its allies in the Asian Pacific, like Australia, South Korea, and Taiwan. Now, these arms exports were a big deal for Russia. First off, they brought in lots of money in foreign currencies, making up about 3% of all the stuff Russia sold overseas. But it's not just about the money. These arms sales were a way for Russia to have influence and power in the world. When a country buys weapons from Russia, it becomes dependent on Russian companies for spare parts and maintenance. So that country can't really afford to upset Russia unless they want to completely change their military and start using American weapons, which cost a whole lot of money. Take, for instance, that one reason why India has been hesitant to criticize Russia over the Ukraine incidents is because India has been buying a lot of military equipment from Russia, and for a very long time. In fact, somewhere between 70 to 80% of India's military gear all comes from Russia or the Soviet Union. If India were to take a strong stand against Russia or Ukraine, Russia could stop selling them weapons. That would mean India couldn't upgrade its military without spending a ton of money to switch to the American systems. On top of that, Russia just might flat out refuse to provide spare parts or do maintenance on India's Russian-made weapons, which would obviously gradually weaken India's military strength. Obviously, India does not want this to happen, especially since its relationship with China is getting more and more tense and there's a real possibility of a major border conflict. Now, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were pretty evenly matched in arms sales. But since the Soviet Union fell apart, the US has generally sold more weapons than Russia. However, in the early 2010s, it did look like Russia might surpass the US in sales, thanks to increased demand from countries like India, China, and Syria. In 2013, for example, Russia actually sold more weapons than the US for once, with $7.9 billion in sales compared to the US's $7.6 billion. But in recent years, Russia's arms exports have been dropping significantly. In 2018, they sold $7.2 billion worth of weapons internationally. That number then went down to $5.6 billion in 2019, then further down to $3.9 billion in 2020, and in 2021 it hit a new low of $2.86 billion. And as you can guess, in 2022 it didn't get any better, and their arms exports decreased even more, reaching just $2.82 billion. This decline happened largely because the Russian government couldn't afford to sell the weapons it needed for the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. Moreover, Russia is actually starting to fall behind not only the United States, but also France when it comes to selling weapons. In 2022, France exported a little over $3 billion worth of arms, while Russia lagged behind. To make things worse, Russia only managed to sell weapons to 12 countries in 2022. It might be tempting to blame this huge drop on the pandemic and the situation in Ukraine, but that explanation might be a bit narrow-minded. You see, countries don't only buy weapons during times of conflict. Arms deals are usually long-term investments that require continuous investment. That's why the United States didn't experience a significant decline in its military sales during the pandemic like Russia did. In 2019, the US sold $10.8 billion worth of arms, followed by $9.4 billion in 2020, and then a whopping $11 billion in 2021. Similarly, while the war in Ukraine may have temporarily reduced Russia's available weapons, it also provided an opportunity for them to show off their military hardware to potential customers. Now, let's compare to the United States. The US's HIMARS system performed so well in Ukraine that they received a surge in orders from different countries. We're talking Australia, Taiwan, and Poland all have expressed their intention to buy more, and even Germany has partnered with Lockheed to create their own version of the system. On the other hand, Russia's not so impressive military performance in the Ukraine has had the exact opposite effect and actually deterred potential customers. To make matters worse for Russia, Serbia and Algeria both have criticized Russia for not fulfilling their weapon requirements. But well, it's not just about Ukraine at all. In fact, Russian arms orders were declining way before the Ukraine invasion happened. Listen carefully because there is a catch. The decline for Russia actually started back in 2019, way before the invasion ever happened. There are two big reasons behind Russia's decreasing arms exports, and they have a lot to do with China and India. You see, China and India both used to rely heavily on Soviet and Russian imports when they were still developing countries without their own strong military industries. However, as their economies grew, so did their ability to produce their own military equipment. They started to feel less and less dependent on Russia and believed that they could create even better systems themselves. That's why Russian imports to India have dropped from almost $4 billion in 2013 to $1.3 billion today. As for China, their imports from Russia went down from nearly $2 billion in 2018 to just over $700 million now. But here's another interesting part. China and India aren't just reducing their imports from Russia, they're also becoming the go-to suppliers for other developing countries. China's arms exports went from almost nothing in the 90s to over $2 billion today. Now, this is definitely bad news for Russia. It means less money for their arms manufacturers and the Kremlin, but it goes beyond that. Russia's power and influence in the world are taking a huge hit. Arms exports used to be one of the few areas where Russia looked like a superpower, and the developing world's reliance on Russian and Soviet technology gave the Kremlin a lot of leverage. Unfortunately for Putin, if this decline in arms exports continues, which seems very likely, Russia's influence on the global stage will keep diminishing. So as we've explained, it's not just about the war in Ukraine. There are bigger forces at play, and Russia is facing a serious challenge in maintaining their position as a major player in the arms business. In a nutshell, Russia is facing a collapse in terms of arms exports. Conventional buyers are either looking for alternative markets or focusing on self-reliance for arms production. Putin might need to come up with a different strategy, otherwise the Russian defense industry could face more losses in the coming years. If you liked this video, please do subscribe to the channel for more updates. And also let us know your thoughts on this video in the comments below.